Members, good afternoon. We've formed a quorum, and it's also the appointed time. This is the first meeting of the housing panel in the Chinese New Year. May I wish you every success in the new year. May I remind members that you can use the request to speak button if you would like to speak on any item on the agenda. The first thing on the agenda is confirmation of minutes of our meeting. The minutes were circulated to members on the 3rd of December, and the Secretary has not received any proposal for amendments. So can we confirm the minutes, please? Yes. Information papers issued since the last meeting. For details, please refer to the agenda. All right, item 3, agenda for our next meeting. The next meeting is scheduled for the 1st of April at 2:30. Mrs. Ip, you asked me to use the request to speak button, but it's not responding. This is because the officials have yet to arrive. But I'd like to speak on the third agenda item, agenda for the next meeting. All right, we'll come to that. The next meeting is scheduled for the 1st of April at 2:30. There are two proposals from the administration. First, introduction of special rates on vacant first-hand private residential units by amending the rating ordinance. And second, transport infrastructure works for development at Diamond Hill. Members, do we agree that the two should be included into our next meeting? Right, if you have other suggestions, please request to speak. Mrs. Regina Ip, when is the administration going to respond to my private member's bill? According to the Secretariat, the administration has confirmed that the private member's bill from Mrs. Regina Ip and Ms. Alice Mack have been received, and they will try to provide a written reply in mid-March. But then there is a pressing situation. The Link REIT has disposed of its property to God Capital. And this morning I met a number of complainants, and because God Capital has evicted some of the operators. At first, they were asked to leave by the 3rd of June in Twin Moon. In fact, it's really a very hostile environment because it has just been newly renovated by the Link quite soon, quite recently. And then because of our objection, the date is now deferred. And I heard that they're going to do the same for the shop operators at Tai Wo Hao. So can you ask them to advance the discussion of this matter? You can ask the Deputy Secretary. Thank you. We have received the suggestion from Mrs. Regina Ip. Secretary, please inform the administration and ask it to consider arranging a public hearing on this matter on the Link REIT. Because in December last year, our Deputy Chairman, Mr. Andrew Wen, requested the same, and then it has been put under our list of outstanding items. Now, Mrs. Regina Ip has once again revived this request. So is there any objection from the administration? If not, can the Secretariat write to the administration? Deputy Chairman. Thank you. This subject is close to our heart. And we don't know whether more commercial properties will be sold by the Link REIT. And as regards our public hearing, we all know how public hearings operate. There may not be time for members to have a discussion after the deputations have spoken. Perhaps we should have a special meeting to discuss this topic as well. All right, we will try to discuss, consider this after the meeting. As for the public hearing, well, we are all very anxious about the link-related issues. And as for the proposal by Mr. Andrew Wen, I will try to work out schedule with the secretariats afterwards. Ms. Ellis-Mack, I think the most easy way is, since that we all agree that we should have a public hearing, then we can divide the public hearing into two parts. First, we meet deputation. Second, discussion with the administration, so we don't have to schedule another date. Mrs. Reason, I agree with you, because Mr. Jeffrey Lam chaired a subcommittee on commercial properties and car parks owned by the link, but the subcommittee has stopped operation, so there is no avenue for this item to be discussed, and then the operator's livelihood are being disrupted. All right. So we have agreed on the agenda for the next meeting, so please note that. Agenda item number 4. Please invite the administration to join us. We're going to discuss review of the income and asset limits for PRH for 2019-20. For details, please refer to the paper. And members, you are welcome to press the request to speak button. From the administration, we have Mr. Stanley Ying, Permanent Secretary for Transport and Housing. Ms. Esther Leung, Deputy Secretary for Transport and Housing, responsible for housing, and Ms. Sandra Lam, Assistant Director from the Housing Department. Once again, I appeal to members to use the request to speak button. All right. So, Mr. Gary Fan, Mr. Lau Kok Fan, Ms. Ellis-Mack, Mr. Leung Yu-chong, Mr. K.K. Kwok, Mr. Ho Kai-ming, Mr. Ray Chen, Dr. Cheng Chong-tai, and Mr. Andrew Wen, our Deputy Chairman. They've indicated their request to speak. I will invite you to speak after the administration has briefed us on the item. Mr. Stanley Ying, please. Thank you. Chairman, every year the Housing Department updates its income and asset limits for PRH, and every year, based on the established mechanism, we gather data for the purpose of updating the income and asset limits. Every time we will come to consult this panel first, and then the consolidated views will be forwarded to the Subsidized Housing Committee of the HA for its consideration. So please allow us a few minutes for Ms. Sandra Lam, our Assistant Director, to brief you on the mechanism. Thank you. The income and asset limits of PRH applicants cannot exceed the levels set by the HA. As said, the HA has established mechanism for calculating the income and asset limits that will be reviewed once a year. First, the review mechanism for the income limits. First, the basis is the household expenditure plus a 5% contingency, and as for the expenditure, it is divided into housing and non-housing expenditures. On the left-hand side, we have the housing costs, and it is arrived at by multiplying the unit rents for private flats of comparable to PRH by the average reference flat size. And we use the data from the latest Census and Statistics Department's survey. And that is for this time is the third quarter of last year. And then we also try to find out the average reference size, that is average space allocated to PRH applicants. As regards the non-housing costs, that is based on the average non-housing expenditure of the lower half expenditure group obtained from household expenditure survey, adjusted by either the change in CPI-A excluding housing costs or income factor, that is the change in nominal wage index, whichever is the higher. Using the change in nominal wage index as factor was confirmed by the HA in 2013 so as to reflect the change in earnings in a timely manner. Now, using the mechanism, the review for 2019-20 is as follows.
And for non-housing expenditure, well, like I just said, they were based on the change in CPIA or change in nominal wage index, whichever the higher. For 2018-19-20, the nominal wage index of 4.1% is higher than the change of CPIA. So therefore, we have decided to adopt the change in nominal wage index. So they list out the proposed income limit for the 1 to 4 person household. And overall speaking, for the 2019-20, compared to last year, there will be increased by 4.3%. After going over the income limits, so we move on to the review mechanism, PRH asset limit. According to the established mechanism, the asset limits are adjusted with reference to the CPIA movement. And the change in CPIA as compared to the same quarter of the previous year, you will see there is a 3.1% growth. For the coming year, the asset limit will correspondingly adjust to 3.1% north upward. And for the detail, you can go through the document, and that's the end of my brief introduction. So we can see 12 members are putting up their hand to speak. So this discussion will wrap by 3:30. I hope that each colleague would have a 3-minute round, question and answers included. I will try to allocate a second round if it's not enough. First, Mr. Gary Fan. Well, the income asset limit will be revised upward for the coming year. Therefore, making foreign families eligible for public housing. What's not clear in the document, in the Paris 17, it was mentioned that claimed we're unable to estimate the number of additional households who apply for PRH due to new limits, quote unquote. So, by common sense, the government should have collected the estimated number of an eligible additional household and the asset limits, and so that it was able to deduce the number of new proposed new applications. So the government does not keep information. If we don't keep this kind of information, how could you decide on building so that the flats configuration, excluding a singleton household, the quota system for the 2-person or above household? If you don't have any information on their family composition and the number of applications, how do you have long-term planning or for allocation exercise? Permanent Secretary, Ms. Stanley Ying, that's the first question. Let me answer these 2 questions first. The established mechanism to determine the asset and income limit is really purely derived from the data. Well, can you tell me yes or no? No. It's stated in the document that no. Do you want to explain why we didn't keep this information? I think it's flawed. I want you could answer my second question. Let me explain why. For example, let's say a Hong Kong household currently not applying for public housing system, not eligible. Let's say a 4-person household. The data show, well, the Census Department data that as a 4-person household, when they apply for public housing, if they're eligible, there could be a 3 or 2-person household. Therefore, they're not on our waiting list. And for the planning, the Housing Authority planning, well, you know, our size, well, they have flexibility in the sizes, and they're not only waiting for new units, and every year we have recovered some 7,000 units. Well, there's a great public concern that the newly arrivals, even though they own assets housing in the mainland, says they apply for Hong Kong public housing, that is due to the institutional flaw. Even though they have made a declaration, and because the government cannot investigate, well, in respond to this loophole or injustice? How the government consider tighten the eligibility, or how do they vet their assets outside Hong Kong? That the assets outside Hong Kong, for example, domestic property, is not regarded as housing, since they cannot live in a property outside Hong Kong. You can see that the asset limit, they only count the domestic property in Hong Kong. If you own domestic property outside Hong Kong, you still apply for PH. However, you have to comply with income limit, asset limit. While they are in compliance, while they make a declaration, and since, well, that institutional loophole, how will the government plan to plug this? Permanent Secretary. Well, things had to do with the assets outside of Hong Kong, including domestic property. First, we have to make them make a statutory declaration. If the declaration is not to be accurate, there will be legal consequences, and we're based on tip-off, and where we would take a follow-up. I don't have such information in hand. Every year, we have tip-off cases, and we have successive prosecution. So nothing can be done without intelligence, or you don't plan to reform the system. I suppose we can give a reply to him after the meeting. Next, Mr. Lau Kwok Fan. Look at the income and the asset limit review. Well, that's a recurrent exercise annually. You can see some self-conflicting numbers. On one hand, it seems to be relaxed in light of actual circumstances, so that there may be more household eligible. Well, maybe they noted the comments from last year that the percentage of 2% household seems to be revised more, as 2% to revised upward to 6-point-something%. Even as we get to an 18,000, not encouraging a working couple to both worked. Well, besides looking at the expenditure data, would you consider other factors? After relaxation, there will be more people eligible. And now that the waiting time is about 5.5. Last year it was 4.7. So 1 year on, it had been extended by about 8 months or more. So the government would still rule out rent subsidy. You look at the waiting time for public housing is getting longer, and the housing authority, besides claiming to build more public housing, however, that would take time. There seems to be no other solution. Would there be other measures that can help those waiting? Permanent Secretary. President, I think that the relevant topics have been discussed multiple times on this occasion. For the formulation of long-term housing strategy have been discussed. We've been already decided that the housing problem have been due to the supply-demand imbalance. To address this, we have to have a sustainable increasing of supply, and we have been updating, so not able to reach our target. For the past few years, besides boosting new housing supply, the rent subsidy and rent control and so on, we felt that it is not able to tackle the problem. Well, after the announcement of the budget, these topics have been discussed again, and the Finance Secretary had to explain why it have not been adopted. What he have been doing, that whatever land is available, we try to build housing as soon as possible, and also try to create land, and to address any interim shortage of inappropriate housing conditions. We also try to provide transitional housing. However, rent subsidy and control based on the aforementioned justification, I feel this is the right solution. Well, on long-term housing strategy, well, back in 2013, and now it's been 6 years. Not only not able to relieve the housing crisis or maintain the status quo, is actually deteriorated. So the annual review on the asset limit, and yet the weightings time deteriorated in time you're ruling out rent subsidy and control. What other measures do you have in store to improve the situation? The established mechanism of the housing authority when making the revision of the asset income limit is based on empirical data in deriving the right amount of revision instead of shirking to the problem but deliberately suppressing the limit. So it has a policy a mechanism in place to monitor to adjust the limits or not. Well, it has been determined in the long-term housing strategy that the construction of housing is not able to meet our target. This is not ideal. We need to keep working. Thanks, Alice Mack. We understood that this revision is based on established mechanism. For the one-person household, for them to make a queue for public housing, after MPF deduction, they should not make more than $12,000 per month. Well, in Hong Kong nowadays, if we can't make $12,000 a month, they have to feed and clothe themselves. How they can survive with that money? Well, they're not the elderly. Well, they're not on another queue. They have to wait very long time for public housing. And for the housing department, for this non-elderly singleton household, is there any way to help them? So for the talk of the vacancy tax and rent control and rent subsidy that was advocated by the FTU, are you going to sit on your hands? I know there are hundreds of thousands been waiting for public housing, and for the singleton non-elderly household, those making $11,000 or $12,000 a month or even lower, they couldn't live on that money. And we asked them to wait queue up for a decade before being allocated public housing. What can you help them? We care about the accommodation problems of this singletons. We have to create more housing to help them. We care about their income and their economy. Prime Secretary, of course I'm talking housing with you. Why I'm talking about income with you? Please don't just tell me common sense. Can you offer me some concrete solutions, or either you tell me that I don't have any solutions? Prime Secretary, Mr. Ying. To address their housing issue, the key is to create more housing, which we're working on it. We care about their livelihood. Other policy bureaus are working, for example, all kinds of subsidies and working a family allowance that could be offer some relief to them. President, I know that we're not able to get any answers from you. You can't drill blood from a stone. All along these years, the administration keep insisting that rent subsidy and rent control doesn't work, and yet not able to come with any solution to help this long-time queuers. Not only those living on subdivided units, those singleton non-elderly household, we receive tons of complaints where you can't live on just $10,000 a month without public housing. Instead, just what Mr. Ying told you, I just built more housing. So you're telling me that this is common sense, a no-brainer. You're not helping the public. While I'm taking the three-pronged approach of vacancy, tax, rent control, rent subsidy, why are you unwilling to adopt it? Is that seems that you only had the duty to build more housing while the rest aren't, and just leave them to be? Mr. Leung Yu Chung. So the Mr. Caravan mentioned was questioned. Let's say about owning property outside of Hong Kong. I wonder how the government investigate these cases. Even though you have been tipped off on intelligence, not all cases will get tip-offs. Would the government have any rigorous mechanisms to plug this loophole? For the revision of the income limit, they will make more people eligible and will prolong the waiting time. The only way that is to keep boosting the supply to public housing, which we all got it. Take a single-person household. They have been waiting for over 10 to 20 years for public housing. Once you revise the upward limit, they're not able to cover rent on private house in the private market on the income and before MPF deduction of about $12,000. To rent an SDU, it costs about $4,000 to $5,000, and for the remaining $7,000 to $8,000, it's actually quite hard to manage with that money.
Because if you are singleton, you tend to have higher expenses, so you cannot really address their difficulties. All right, for 2P, the income limits are less than $20,000. So in a 2P family with single income, then it's hard to survive, and if both persons are working, surely the income limit will be passed. It's impossible that only 1.5p in a family work, and for 3p it's even more serious. So it's probably a couple with a kid, and the limit is the income limit is rather small, and it's hard for the household to take care of their necessary expenditure. So you should at least give them the opportunity to apply. If they can't even apply, then it is really sad. So can you readjust the income limits? Do not just use the non-peerage households expenditure pattern because the level is too low. Can you review it, please? P.S. Mr. Leung has got two parts in his question. First, property ownership outside Hong Kong. Well, it is an asset, conceptually speaking. So if it is an asset, first the applicant is required to make a statutory declaration, and secondly, we conduct sample checks on random basis, and we will confirm whether the applicant has declared his assets outside Hong Kong, including property ownership. And then we also act on intelligence. Every year we have received reports, and there are convictions in court every year, and if you expect us to do more, we can try to do so. And as for property ownership outside Hong Kong, we talk about all places outside Hong Kong. So ownership in London and Canada are also covered, but right now it is not possible for us to gather evidence from all over the world. Even if we try to, it may not be possible. So very often we use a similar system for asset declaration. So we will take random checks, and then we will also consider prosecutions. And as for the income limits, they are based on some figures the HA has been using all along. It's true that for some households they may exceed that limits. For 2P and 3P families, now if we look at statistical data, then for a 2P family, for some there is only a single income. For some there is double income, and sometimes they may not be all full-time workers. So if each works 26 days a month and 12 hours per day, then perhaps the income might have exceeded the limit. But then such a household would be above the median family in Hong Kong. All right. I've already drawn the line, and for members who would like to ask questions, if you are in the council building, please do come down before I draw the line. Mr. Kwok Wai Keung, although the adjustment is according to established mechanism and the overall increase is 4.2%, and as a result, another 5,000 to 6,000 households will become eligible. So for this, some 6,000 households start to apply now, they cannot be rehoused in the next 10 years. Although you say that the housing issue is a legacy of previous governments, can you say that because of that you can turn a blind eye to the situation for those who are living for those who are inadequately housed, paying very high rent? Well, if you introduce vacancy tax on flats, then at least you can help some of these families. And how come you have refused to do so? And at HA, we have discussed the mechanism, the review mechanism, which hasn't been adjusted for many years. This 5% contingency, is it sufficient? Do these households have to be so poor that they only have a few $100s left at the end of each month before they can be eligible? And should all households be only barely make ends meet before they're eligible? So can the contingency be increased to 10% of the household expenditure? And in each category, there's an increase of $500 to even $1,000. I'd like to know whether there are any well-off families that have exceeded the limits, and as a result of your adjustment, they no longer exceed the limits. So will they be automatically struck off from your list of well-off tenants? First, rent control and options that have been discussed a number of times. I will not repeat the government's position again, because the government has always has been hearing such views from the community, and we have had a number of discussions. And as for the different statistics, we work out the data. And then last year when we were here, some members raised issues with the mechanism itself. They were brought back to the HA for its discussion, and the HA would have decided to adjust the mechanism if they have felt the need. And as for the 5% contingency, well, recently we have just updated HA members on the background of the mechanism. If members have views, we can bring them back to the HA for its consideration. And as for the well-off tenants, yes, Mr. Kwok's view is correct. And around October every year, there will be a small group of tenants required to submit returns to us, and in April another batch. And with the adjustment in income and assets limits, then the multiples will also be adjusted accordingly. Mr. Ho Kai-ming, now if in a 2P family, a couple each works 10 hours a day, using earning SMW, then each will make 9,750, and together they will exceed the limit a little bit. So if they each earn 4.5 hours of OT per month, then the limit would be exceeded. I don't know how many people in Hong Kong do not have to work overtime. So do you expect employers to require them to work OT without compensation? Because so long as each works 4.64 hours of OT per month, then they will not be eligible. So for a couple working as security guards, if one works 12 hours a shift and the other 8 hours, then that will be okay. Otherwise, they will not be eligible. And now we'll talk about the bottom 35% of the households in Hong Kong before they can be eligible. I'd like to know whether this is the target of the administration, or does the administration have its own objective, or should it be adjusted? We understand that once this is adjusted, then there will be a further adjustment. My question is, will a couple working 10 hours each paid at SMW be able to survive? So you're not willing to introduce a rent control and also tenancy control. How are you going to tackle this problem? Mr. Ying, as I said, the income pattern of households differs. In a 2P family, it can be both working full-time, or only one working full-time, or one working full-time and the other working part-time, and the pattern would affect the household income. And the limit setter is very close to the medium income of non-owner occupied households living in private accommodation. Now, if the limit is set at too high, that means the chance of the applicants getting a flat will be lower. Mr. Chen Chi-chun. Chairman, we discussed the income and asset limits of PRH, but if we do not have a mechanism to verify whether the asset declared is true or not, if there is underreporting or non-reporting of the asset, then it's pointless to discuss the mechanism here. I'm quite concerned about people who deliberately underreport or not reporting their overseas property ownership. I asked a written question quite a while ago, and the reply I got was, in the past 3 years, the administration has checked 1,800 households and dealt with 350 reported cases. About 50 cases did not report overseas residential property ownership, and there were only 4 cases of successful conviction. Only 4. All right. 1,800 households were checked on a random basis. I'd like to know the criteria for this figure. Do you have a certain target for random checking every year? And what are the procedures? Do you ask the tenants for interviews, or you take the initiative to investigate? I do understand that there are hundreds of countries in the world. If someone has a villa at Mauritius, then I know it's difficult for you to find that out. But let's say, for example, there are many new arrivals with properties and also fields and land in their hometown, and they may boast of their possession. So can we just pass the names to authorities in the mainland and have it confirmed? I'd like to know whether you have such a mechanism. If there is no mechanism whatsoever, then, well, while you say that it is against the law not to report such ownership, there is nothing you can do about me. And I can also hold such properties under a company's name or a relative's name. And out of 50 cases, there were only 4 convictions. What about the remaining 40-odd? If it is qualified, their eligibility, or have you recovered their flats? Well, Mr. Ray Chen, yes, I have seen the reply you referred to, although I don't have it with me. And the figures you quoted are helpful to members. Now, when it comes to checking, it is on a random basis, unless we are talking about intelligence-led operations. Now, because there's random checking, then it's really on a random basis. The HD has a lot to do when it comes to breaches, and it's not just about underreporting of assets. We would like to secure more resources so we can cover more cases.
抽查或者
And we receive a report when we investigate. Well, we could take various approach. For example, we will inquire other governments to see any information they can supply. Well, it's the question whether they will supply such information. Have you actually made inquiries to the mainland government? Well, not mainland specifically. Well, outside Hong Kong, we will try to ask them where they may or may not reply. Well, we prosecuted based on false declaration. Well, there's a criteria. For example, we can disqualify application or to take back this public housing. So it would not necessarily involve conviction for this to happen. I hope they can make a supplement afterwards. Permanent Secretary, please supplement. I want to make two decisions. I need to draw the line here since been outside their allocated time. I urged panel members to work with each other and also offer the ministry can offer a concise response. Dr. Chen Chung-tai, I want to follow up on the income means testing, income asset testing, and look at the past. Those convicted on false declaration or concealing to obtain public housing, the conviction, well, or the penalty is just rather a fine of $20,000 or imprisonment. And while they're simply breaching the housing ordinance, section 26 or 27, and there are voices that there will be in increasing cases of hiding assets and making false declarations on the rise. Would the government consider toughening up the penalty or need to revise the legislation so as to enhance deterrent effect? Mr. Yang? I will not repeat Dr. Chang's question here. And the penalty as set out, the sentencing as set out in the statute need to take into account the similar offenses. And when court make the sentencing guidelines where there is a room for revision, we can look into it. Well, problems like these, well, they need to have the proportionality on the sentencing. On safeguarding, I understood that the government would look into it. I got some time left. I want to make some commentary. Another question on the statutory mandatory wage and the income limit. For the biannual review of the minimum wage, well, this year is about 4.2%, and now the minimum wage are revised for at 8.4%. It'll be $77.60 soon. And now that actually you can see the minimum wage has, well, the revision is lagging behind the minimum wage levels. Well, when the minimum wage is only reviewed biannually, and while we're doing an annual adjustment, especially this year, they'll be further revised this year. I've actually found out from the minimum wage commission on the any raise. Actually, this year, the percentage is actually twofold. While this adjustment review exercise is done annually, well, we had to do a two adjustment will only catch up with one adjustment for the minimum wage. I think to take into the Dr. Cheng took into account of last year's adjustment as well. And Joanne, Vice Chairman. What the public would notice that this is a recurrent exercise. Well, it would not be much impact for those already in public housing, since there will also be entitled for pay rise. I see there will be some gap, and while able to catch up overall, if we don't move, actually some farm household will become ineligible. And last October, in the same panel, and on November 28th, in the Electoral Council meeting, I had the same question on the working family allowance. I found it strange that all the allowances, for example, the higher wage allowance and the OALA, the school expenses allowance, that actually been exempted as income, and yet the WFA isn't. In October, we moved a motion on November 28th. We got a written reply from administration. The government claimed that in 2019-20, they hope that they can review and hope to see can WFA have been put on exempted items, but yet to bear fruit with the government and follow up. Well, for those who deserve punishment or investigation, for example, making false declaration, well, on the random checking, I don't see there been much effort put into it. On the manpower and those handling tip-offs, how many people were there? I see these. Mr. Yang said they would try to lobby for more resources. So what is the existing establishment handling such work? Let me answer the second part of the question first. I can't give you the figures on the manpower. The housing department carry a lot of duties. I need to deploy. Do they have a dedicated unit? They actually handle all sorts of investigation, for example, an abuse of public housing and the racial suggest from time to time where reasonable. I hope they allocate resources since it's an ongoing work. However, I cannot provide you with the exact figures. The first part of the question, I touched on it lightly earlier. And now we should need to. Actually, we've been consulting the Subsidized Housing Committee on this income as limit. Therefore, this will focus on this item. In the course of deliberation, there also been a host of relevant issues, and we let the Subsidized Housing Committee to whether they want to take into account. For the WFA, been touched on in LegCo and in Housing Authority, and while today we bring it up again, this issues will be briefed to the Subsidized Housing Committee. Let them decide after we set on this two limit and with a lot of different income streams and all different asset classes, and whether this will be count or doesn't count. And we usually will ask the HEC to decide. I have a motion, so I see that. So my reminded colleagues, I now receive two motions from members, and the secretary provided copies to you. We have a quorum of 12. For those colleagues in the town, for those colleagues, please come down to deal with these motions. Next, Mr. Edichu, I have 3 questions. Previously, the Electoral Council have endorsed the amendments motion by Mr. Vincent Cheng on transitional housing. Besides the 2 billion, I wonder if you have decided that's for in your budget you have decided to set a 2 billion fund. So it would be included into the long-term housing strategy report and turn it into a target. And second, for housing authority or other departments will pick up the task of providing transitional housing. This have been carried in the amendments of the motion. So how would you respond? Mr. Ray Chen spoke about the administration response to the written inquiry for the past 3 years, with those concealing the property ownership outside Hong Kong. There were 50 cases of such. So if Mr. Ying have such figures, can you tell us out of these 50 cases, are they mainly involving mainland property? So it's not that we're discriminating. So to set up a recurrent mechanism for cooperation and to deter the occurrence of such cases, and that we'll have a basis for that. Third question. When I visit the constituencies, a lot of residents see the income limit is set too low, so sometimes they would take their pay by cash to evade your income limit. I heard plenty of anecdotes myself. For let's say for taking their pay by cash to evade the income limit, and any action been taken, it shows that this limit is detached from reality. So are you forcing people to resort to such ways? So the more they take their pay by cash, then therefore they will not be given labor protection. So have we ever considered your ramifications, Mr. Ying? For Mr. Chu's first part of the question, of this 2 billion transitional housing fund that announced in the budget, I will not repeat them here. As for whether the transitional housing be counted towards the long-term housing strategy, I believe that in the legislative questions, the Secretary had replied that for the long-term housing are not housing that could be demolished within a few years. Therefore, transitional housing would not be included. And for the division of responsibility, the Bureau Chief had explained that the housing authority would concentrate on its role on the task that the public is not satisfied. And we have a fund and dedicated task force to help the communities for this work. And for the 50 cases, I don't have the details on hand. I need to get back to you later. And for the income levels, there are different income categories. Cash income is counted as income, and the applicant or a tenant report their income, they have to include that. It's not right for them not to report it. We have also the investigation approach. We reasonable grounds to believe or receive tip-offs. We found that we have concealed their payment or income or concealed their assets. In accordance with the housing ordinance, will disqualify the application or take legal action and so forth. Next, Mr. Wishiwei. First, I would like to follow on the non-elderly singleton household. Actually, it took more than 2 decades. And for 418 score, for the start from 18, they would take 30 years. And in order to be vetted, the new approach was that 5 years on a row, they will have to review the eligibility, so before they can be allowed to stay in the queue. You have a strategy to adjust the number of one-person unit, then the public will be more accepting. And now you're attempting to suppress the demand for this one-person unit, so that these units, the demand will be, for example, through the scoring mechanism and the 5-year review mechanism to filter out applicants. I think you are sending a bad message to the public that is not dealing the applications on the basis of need. Well, they only need to queue 30 years, and in interim, if their income have exceeded the limit, they will be removed from the queue, while this criteria is not applied to other households. Hope the Secretary can look into the insurance policy dividends as part of their recurrent income. I think the dividends from insurance policy are very complicated. that's able something that you can draw and use as cash. Well, very often they're able to draw that dividend by form of a loan. So actually, this is more like a loan as stated in most policies. And while we calculate the income, you just treat the dividend as income divided by 12 and become the monthly income.
Of course, I understand that P.S. you've mentioned that is rather complicated as to what should be included and what not. And but insurance is an issue, so please think about the policy for non-elderly singleton and also the calculation of dividends from policies. P.S. Yes, as you said, there are different scenarios. Should dividends from policies be included as income? I think I have colleagues that are more familiar with this subject than I, so forgive me if I cannot give you an immediate answer. And as for the policies, they all came from discussion under the LTHS. Now, for some singletons, they have waited for a long time, and will they still be eligible? But by the time they are considered, and I think the housing authority has is not trying to suppress demand. If based on our criteria, there is still the need, singletons, non-elderly singletons can continue to remain on the waiting list. For instance, we sent them a letter asking them to reconfirm their applications. A certain percentage of applicants have not responded. Now, the intention is not to manually suppress the demand. Rather, we want them to confirm whether they still have the demand based on the eligibility criteria. Well, the letter requires him to declare his income and assets again. Now, if he has exceeded the limits, then he can be disqualified. And if he returns false information to you, again, he can be disqualified. But you are not asking him about the situation now, because the flat will only be allocated to me 30 years down the road. And if you ask me today whether I still have the demand 30 years down the road, how can you expect me to give you an answer? Can you please give us a reply later? And it is now Mrs. Regina Yip's turn. And may I appeal to members, we're going to vote on two motions moved by members very soon. We are still short of a quorum. So for members who are in the council building, please come down to room 1. Mrs. Regina Yip. I am grateful to members for pointing out that by raising the two limits, the waiting list will be longer. So can you tell us how we can help them? Can you tell us what is the accommodation of people on the application on the waiting list? Are they living with their family? Are they living in subdivided units? Are they paying very high rent? We have to know their housing conditions before we can help them more in a more targeted manner. P.S. I think we have got two types of information that may address Mrs. Regina Yip's concern. On an annual basis, the HA does a survey to find out the age and educational qualifications and housing conditions of the applicants on the waiting list. Secondly, when we look at the supply and demand under LTHS, we have a definition for inadequately housed. By this, we mean those living in SDUs or industrial buildings. And among those living in SDUs, half of them are waiting for a PRH unit. If these people can be allocated PRH as soon as possible, then they can move out of the SDUs. So we do have such information. Mrs. Regina Yip. When it comes to SDUs, the government is working on a transitional housing fund. Can the PS tell us how many people do you expect to help with that fund? PS, in the recent budget, it was mentioned that earlier this year, the council approved a 1 billion fund, so different sectors can apply to use the fund for various purposes, including providing transitional housing on government idle sites. And as for the transitional housing fund, we have yet to iron out the details, and we can only start after we have got the funding approval from the council. We have received different proposals from different organizations, and we have yet to come up with estimates for the future. Now, if it is now you talk about $2 billion, not 4 billion or 6 billion. So you must have a rough idea. At least you should have a ballpark figure. Should it be a few hundreds or few thousands? At least you should have some idea. P.S. As I said, now if each unit requires $500,000, then we can work out how many flats can be provided. But even though we have set up a fund, that doesn't mean that it is going to be recurrent, and it may be well received. If so, we may ask the Finance Committee to inject more money into the fund. We have not got the details now. When they are available in the future, we will inform members. All right, we have 2 motions to deal with, but according to our House rules, we have yet to form a quorum. So may I appeal to members to come back to room 1. Dr. K.K. Kwok has requested to speak, but he was not here. Now he has returned. Dr. Kwok. Thank you. I'd like to follow up on a question asked by members. That is on the statistics and random checking. It is not a secret that some applicants can be new arrivals, and you said that you can go to all over the world to check. Of course, it's unlikely that you will go to Saudi Arabia to check. So do you have a mechanism to check applicants that are likely to own residential properties in the mainland? I think it is logical, since many applicants are people owning residential properties in the mainland. Now, there is no discrimination. It's just the fact that some of them have not reported their residential property ownership. Now, for a 4P family, the new limit is $29,240. Well, only on housing, the household might have already spent half of its income, and there are also expenses on food and raising the children. So such an income limit is making life difficult for households. So people may ask their employers to pay them with cash. Now, for the modular houses in Singapore, they can cover 80% of the population based on their income. And our system here has caused many strategies. You may say that by raising the limit, the waiting list will only get longer and longer. But you know, for property prices, new flats cost more than $20,000 per square foot. So it is rather heartless to ask people to become property owners. So I think you should have a new limit, not for the rent, but for the property prices. Now, for the first year, we will randomly check a number of households. That is really on a random basis. We will not target at a particular type of applicants. we're told that somebody has got a residential property in a country in Southeast Asia. Well, but many of them are from the mainland. Well, many of them are not. Now, this is our thinking. If we're wrong, do point it out. There are people who are from the mainland, but there may also people who own residential properties outside the mainland. So our system is really random, and if there are reports, then it depends on the substance of the report. This is our practice. We are happy to consider suggestions from members. The HA has a mechanism to work out the income and asset limits. Once the limits are set, then there are bound to be people who are eligible because they are below the limit, and people who are not because they're above the limit. Take a 4P family as an example. If there is only one income earner, one full-time income earner, or two full-time income earner, or three working part-time, they will still be covered by this limit, unless we are talking 3 out of the 4 persons in a household all working 26 days a month, 12 hours a day, then they will exceed the limit. So, all right, if we raise the limit to allow such a family to be eligible to apply for PRH, yes, that means for households, for 4P households with only one full-time worker, 2 full-time worker, or 3 part-time workers, they will have to wait longer before they can be allocated flats. All right, we will have to deal with the motion now. Please ring the quorum bell, and for those who are still in the council building, please return to room 1 to take part in the voting. I have received 2 motions from Mr. Andrew Wen and Mr. Lau Kwok Fan and Dr. Junius Ho, respectively. They've been photostated to members, and I rule that the 2 motions are relevant to our topic, and we can only deal with the 2 motions when we have a quorum.
Let's start with Mr. Andrew Wen's motion first. Well, the bell must be rung for the full 5 minutes.
好嗱，不如咁樣啦，我哋而家咧其實就係夠咗法定人數，但我哋都要
We had a quorum, but we still have make sure the bell around for the full 5 minutes before we can deal with the motion. Since what they call our members is concerned about the next agenda item, can we Mr. and Wang without his motion? This housing panel expressed disappointment on the Transport Housing Bureau on the lack of follow-up on exempting the working family allowance towards the public housing income, and urged the THB to adopt measures as soon as possible to protect the housing needs of the low-income families.
識去表決啦嚇，咁請同事一陣。
We do vote by show of hands, so when time's up, we can decide. So.
我哋夠鐘亦都夠人，咁就請贊成呢個議案嘅同事係舉手，請秘書點算人數。
Secretary, please count the number of votes. Mr. Aulokhin. So 15 members in favor of this motion. I don't see any objections. Any objections? Any abstentions? If not, I declare the motion by Mr. Andrew Wen is carried. And next we deal with Mr. Lau Kwok Fan's motion, and seconded by Dr. Junius Ho. Can Mr. Lau read his motion first? The Housing Authority is reviewing the 2019-20 income and asset limits for public rental housing, which will further lengthen the queuing time for public housing. This panel urged the administration, besides the announced land in Anderson Road and Kai-Tak development area, it should transfer more spade-ready private land, and that would exceed it in the long-term housing strategy for public housing development to compensate for the shortfall in public housing land supply. And also, the administration urged to an independent consultation by administration on rent tenancy control and rent subsidy. I decide this motion is relevant to our topic, and for those in favor, please put up your hand. Secretary, please count the number of votes. We have 10 members in favor. For those who object, please put up your hand. 0. Abstentions? 1. 3, rather. 3 abstentions. I declare that Mr. Lau's motion was carried. Thank you, members. Now move on to the next item, use of non-domestic premises of the Hong Kong Housing Authority. We have the administration team in the room. Please, the government papers have been listed out in the agenda. To walk us through this item, we have Ms. Roslyn Wong, Deputy Director of Housing, Estate Management. Ms. Josephine Xu, Assistant Director of Housing. 2. Ms. Ling Kok-yi, Chief Estate Surveyor, Commercial Property, Acting Housing Department. Ms. Carol Kong, Chief Estate Surveyor, Commercial Properties, Acting Housing Department. Members who would like to speak, press the button now. So far, we have 8 members who pressed the button. Let me read out the order. Alice Mack, Lau Kwok Fan, Andrew Wen, Gary Fan, Ho Kai Ming, Wu Chi Wai, Kwok Wai Keung, and Mrs. Virginia Yip. The administration will walk us through the paper. Deputy Director, please. First, thanks for the panel's invitation for today's meeting. So this year we've set out the latest utilization situation on non-domestic property. The primary function of HA is to provide affordable public rental housing to low-income families with housing needs, and to time to time provide other non-domestic facilities, for example, car parks and retail facilities to serve the residents. In last December, there are about 1.76 square meters of non-domestic facilities under HA. About 49% are welfare facilities. Provide, for example, for children, elderly, family, medical, and education services. And also the retail facilities of 14%. About 246 square meters through our flexible deployment. The vacancy rate will stay at a low level of 1.2%. Beside retail and welfare facilities, the other 37% are for other uses. For example, the storage room in the domestic areas and for office use. From time to time, we'll review the usage of the storeroom, and we're also actively converting the storeroom to domestic units and the other non-domestic purposes. And also 161 car parks providing about 30,900 parking spaces with the utilization rate about 90%, 60%. From time to time, it will review the use of non-domestic premises from time to time. I'll now hand over to Ms. Josephine Chu to walk over the latest usage situation, and then we'll welcome questions from members. Ms. Chu. I would like to supplement information on welfare, retail, and parking facilities of HKMA property.
係喺零售設施方面呢
On retail, on the late last December, there are about 246,000 square meters of retail facilities. In 2018, well, there are new retail facilities for newly completed housing estate for 2018. There are an additional 18,000 square meters of welfare facilities. Besides new estate, we also conduct various kinds of improvement projects. Since 2001, we've added about 12,000 square meters of retail facilities of existing shopping center and estates. And we have also been implementing various measures on promotion and leasing, providing more mobile facilities and offering a more rich offering. And at the end of December 2018, the overall vacancy rate of retail facility maintained a low level of 1.2%. On welfare facilities, in the planning of new housing developments, the HA will first consult the relevant departments and the NGOs. This arrangement enables the Social Welfare Department to explore the provision of facilities in the comprehensive manner in the early planning stage in order to provide suitable welfare facility in the state under planning. Besides new estates, for existing estate, the HA depends on the need to identify suitable locations to convert them into welfare premises. And for the welfare premises, the HA would, the recommendation of the policy bureaus, there will be a lease at concessionary rent for including a welfare and community services. Besides the welfare premises, they will also provide outreach services for newly completed estates to help the residents adjust. And we have new arrangements for the For the non-domestic premises not in use, including mutual aid committee offices, they will be leased to the relevant NGOs at concession rent for them to set up temporary work bases. On car parking facilities, the HA reviewing the occupancy rate will launch various measures so as to fully utilize the parking spaces for optimal use of public resources. The overall usage rate had actually reached 96%. The government will also dovetail with government policies on the adoption of electric vehicles. In HA car parks, about 600 parking spaces, but installed EV charging facilities at the end of December 2018. In view of the keen public demand for parking spaces, the HA, wherever possible, they will boost the number of parking spaces in new and existing public housing developments. And on the usage of the storeroom public housing estates, there are currently 2,500 storeroom in domestic blocks in housing estates, and 21 of those within domestic areas. 80% of those have been leased to the residents and for the contractor to store their supplies. And those outside the domestic areas, there are 400 of those. About 80% have been leased out. And those within the domestic area, they are actually quite small. 80% of those are less than 10 square meters. The HA have been reviewing the use of the storerooms and actively exploring the feasibility of converting them into domestic units, where technically feasible and compliance with the building ordinance. We have completed or conducting conversion works to provide about 40 domestic units. Recently, HA has also obtained the approval for converting additional 30 domestic units. The views that the HA should convert this storeroom into welfare premises. Like I said, the HA had responded to demand to identify storeroom outside domestic areas and convert them into welfare premises. And really, we have converted 8 areas into 18 welfare premises and 2 retail premises. HA will continue to explore various ways to better utilize the storeroom. Also, keep in view the use of non-domestic facilities to ensure the best use of resources to meet the needs of the residents. That's the end of my presentation. So, this item would need to last till 4:25. Actually, the number of members lined up to speak seems to exceed that time. We extend the meeting to 15 minutes and hope that the members could keep their question concise. Let's have the 3-minute round first. Alice Mack, 2 questions. On the retail facilities, I see from the PowerPoint that the overall vacancy rate is kept low at 1.2%. However, this due to attribute 2 factors. For example, the markets and the newly completed housing estate actually being contracted out to a single contractor. Well, of course, they will all be leased out. However, this will be much criticized that if they're a contractor management model. So for the contracting of wet market management, would HA willing to abolish this model, in which the H in favor of HA running the market themselves? And on the storeroom of public housing estates, that the leasing rate about 60%, and you claim that about dozens of them will be converted. And yet this leasing rate is not ideal. We consider resorting to different ways to conduct conversion works as soon as possible. Well, since we have such a tight situation, should it be converted ASAP? For example, Sichuan Estate, after this intake, there will be a shortage of welfare facilities, and some of the welfare NGOs hope to and not able to open new centers. While this problem exists in old and new estate, to the government, well, the department make better use of these spaces. 3 questions for housing department. On the contracting out of HA markets, I understand the public concerns on the contract out arrangement of models on 2018 March and August will be discussed in the Commercial and Housing Committee.
We do understand the public's concern. However, we agree that there is room for improvement when it comes to our monitoring system, and we have enhanced our monitoring measures and leasing arrangements. In newly completed HA markets will continue to use this contracting arrangement, and we will consider the effectiveness of such a scheme, and when necessary, review our measures to monitor the performance of the contractor. And as for conversion of our storerooms, we are going to convert storerooms to residential units where feasible. For those on the ground floor, we'll see whether they can be converted into welfare premises as appropriate. Ms. Alice Mack referred to the situation of Searchin O Estate. Despite the space constraints, we have converted some of the facilities. Mr. Lau Kok Fan, first I've thanked the HA for 9 units originally used for children's home, but they have been vacant for a while, and now they are turned into residential units in Yung Shing Court. We welcome that move. I'd like to know whether there are vacant sites previously used for welfare services. Can they be converted to residential units for better utilization of space, and also storerooms that can also be converted to residential units? Have you taken stock of the number of such units available? Thank you. Thank you very much for mentioning the Yung Shing Court case. Said by Mr. Lau Kok Fan, after a round of study, we finally converted the units reserved for children's home to residential units. They will later be allocated to applicants on the waiting list. Mr. Lau has put it very correctly, that under the HA there are still a few vacant children's homes. After the case at Yung Shing Court, we are now pressing at full steam feasibility studies and applications. When approval is granted, we can start converting them. Thank you. I urge the HA to work faster, because some welfare premises have been left vacant for a long time due to various reasons, and some of the storerooms are not being used as they were in the past because of housing shortage. I think they should be converted to residential units. Given the housing shortage, I think that is the most appropriate approach. And for parking spaces of PRH estates, the provision of parking spaces is based on the standards which were set a long time ago and might be dated already. So in new PRH estates, can you provide more parking spaces? Because many sites for provisional car parks have now been recovered, and we should take the opportunity to provide more car parking spaces in new PRH estates. Thank you. We're doing this on 2 fronts. For new developments, we do not just follow the HK PSG. We use the ceiling as the supply basis, and when necessary and if feasible, we will provide a few more parking spaces. And as for housing estates, if they are vacant, if there is vacant space, we'll see whether it can be converted. Mr. Andrew Wen, Deputy Chairman. Thank you. I think some members have pointed out the crux of the matter. Although the figures look good, now I'm not trying to distort the facts. In fact, there are the figures are a bit inflated, because once you have ask a contractor to take up the operation of a market, the vacancy rates will be very low. Now, there is space not yet taken up. I hope you will not just occupy with some commodities to avoid criticism. And please do not, and then you may, upon criticism, remove some of the stuff, and then make available a few more residential units. But on the whole, I support your approach. For the provision of car parking spaces according to the HKPSG, parking spaces is under-provided. Take Tung Chung as an example. We have only got a few dozens of parking spaces. In the past, even one single housing block would have a dozen or so parking spaces. More and more people are now commercial drivers, and some of them have to take care of company cars. Now, if you are a chauffeur, for instance, your boss will save the rental for a parking space, and the chauffeur will be asked to take care of the parking himself. So what relief do you have? I know that in some new housing estates there is a great shortage of parking spaces. Will you maximize the provision of parking spaces subject to the statutory limits? And conversion of storerooms to commercial, to welfare premises, we don't oppose that. Can you consider allowing us to use them for ward offices as well? Because district councillors find it, or councillors find very hard to find ward offices, and they are sometimes criticized by residents. In the past, the housing department even added space, added unit in some vacant space. Can that be done? Thank you. For parking spaces, as I said, for new housing estates, we will not just fulfill the Hong Kong PSG. On top of that, we will check with the transport department. If it is not against, it doesn't affect the building potential, we will try to increase the number of parking spaces as far as possible. And as for whether storerooms can be converted to welfare premises as well as ward offices, we are already doing that. Under the HA, there are over 300 ward offices. Well, it may not be entirely sufficient, but we will try our very best to accommodate your needs. Mr. Gary Fan, my views are not that complicated. I think I share the views of many members. In October last year, the Ombudsman published a report saying that 39% of the space is not being used, and this is a waste of resources, because land is a valuable resource in Hong Kong, and you have not maximized the potential. With over 2,000 storerooms in public housing estates, I understand that according to the HA, these are very small units. They have only less than 10 meters squares in size, but even for a very small ward office I rent in a shopping mall, it is just as small as it is much smaller than 100 square feet. So long as it is big enough to accommodate 1 or 2 employees, then the conversion of storerooms into welfare premises for NGOs to apply to use is a good policy. So can you consider allowing small NGOs and community organizations to use your storeroom converted offices? I think it is a good idea, and it will also address the issues raised by, or the concerns raised by the Ombudsman in his investigation. Thank you. Yes, this is our direction. When it comes to conversion of storerooms or use of our space, we have to satisfy certain building requirements and also the lease conditions. These constraints are present, but we will still move towards this direction. But there are 159 storerooms being vacant. Not many of them are not affected by lease conditions, and it's not that in terms of conversions they are subject to very complicated restrictions. Some of them are bound by land lease conditions, some are not. We will consider the individuals' cases and look at the location of the vacant storerooms as well. And matching is involved. In some districts, there is a greater demand, in some less. So we have to consider the actual circumstances. Thank you. Mr. Ho Kai-ming. If all HD staff follow the direction of the DD, that will be excellent. The link reads has just increased rent by 12%. Now, if we have competition near the link premises, it will be much better. In Kwun Tong, I don't hear the same views from HD staff as the DD. Now, one is a big development, another is a smaller. They are providing car parking spaces according to the HKPSG, and their practice is entirely different from what the DD said just now. I'd like to know whether your policy is being implemented in all new housing developments. Take Hon Tai Estate's example. The car park is too small, and there is illegal parking on the streets already. Just last week, we had a meeting and asked whether there can be more parking spaces for use by residents nearby. There was no reply at all. So, in new developments, can you have a few more levels of basement so that residents can use it? And so the car parks will not just be open to residents of the housing developments, but members of the public living nearby. And in HOS developments, there is also vacant space that can be put into proper use. Some OCs would like to use them, but then since the report by the Ombudsman a few years ago, the space has been recovered, and the OCs cannot use these storerooms. We have taken up with the HD. Perhaps you can review the use of these vacant space, because each is of the size of a few hundred square feet. So you should consider how the vacant space is put into proper use. Didi, thank you, Mr. Ho, for your question. Regarding the car parking spaces, I will not repeat what I said just now. For existing housing departments, where we know that there is a greater need for parking spaces, we'll see whether additional parking spaces can be added. What about new housing developments? I said that we would adopt the HKPSG. We'll see whether there is capacity and room to provide a little bit more, subject to discussion with the transport department. As for whether we can have a few more basement levels, In all new building works, we provide basement car parks. But of course, there are a few principles. When there is a basement, we have to take into account the construction cost as well as the construction program. Thank you.
Next, Mr. Richie Wei. So just now, the assistant director list out how well the constraints of, well, for example, the land lease conditions. Well, when the public housing, well, actually the land lease have very strict stipulation on the use of space when sharing with the link REIT. However, when it's under single ownership, under a vesting order, under the housing ordinance, so is the vesting order some kind of restrictions, and what restrictions are being subjected to? Well, even by the way of vesting order, you also be subjected by GFA restrictions. Well, I couldn't even even covered walkway or a covered benches may be subject to GFA restrictions. Well, have you actually discussed that with the administration, that within the estate for the public facility, for example, covered benches and walkways will be in breach of the GFA restrictions? The administration keeps stressing that hope they make good optimal use of the land, for example, single site multiple use within the HA areas. Under this policy, does that mean that the non-domestic premises, for now, the 1.5 times plot ratio could be increased so as to realize the concept in HA sites? Assistant Director, on the restriction to individual estate, if it's subject to the land lease restrictions, they'll be bound by the GFA limit. We have to check if actually in breach of the GFA limit, then probably not feasible. So you can't even, a vesting order cannot breach the GFA restrictions, even though they're not a land lease restrictions and need to be bound by the building ordinance. So we are still bound by the GFA limit. Whereas in some situation, to see whether we can obtain exemption, that we can look into. So what is the grounds for exemption under a vesting order? Or how about written information? So, okay, I can communicate with Mr. Wu after the meeting. For the second part, brief answer. On the single site multiple use, is there any chance that could applied to HSA where can use a 1.5 times plot ratio? Well, for some sites, they have an over plot ratio instead of separating domestic and non-domestic portions. If we do it overall, well, we try to maximize this plot ratio for domestic units. If we separate it, it will be subject to a limit. This proposal of use we can bring back to the department for careful consideration. Mr. Kwok Wai Kang. On the overall vacancy rate of commercial premises at 1.2%, is it based on the internal floor space? Based on the 1.2%, let's say you lease out all the big shops, even the most small shop with vacants, they will still make a low percentage. I want to get this confirmed. This. So after selling some facilities to link as despicable, the tenancy purchase schemes estate are equally despicable. For example, the Fenghua estate in Chai Wan, the retail facilities are they under HA ownership, And for Choi Wan Estate, also a TPS estate, I inspected it earlier. Even though the housing authority have set aside allocated some money to the owners corporation when selling to the owners, well, this money would be eventually exhausted, and the owners corporation will try to manage on the cheap. So there'll be a lack of maintenance and repair on the public facilities for Choi Wan Estate, where a secondary school adjoining their path to the bus stop and there's a kindergarten that have complained that the facilities have been too dilapidated and aging. A lack of maintenance would lead to a severe aging. And the playgrounds outside the kindergarten is completely deserted, left barren, and the swing chains have been tied to the structure. Why the HA has no standard and no input and the management, so that the quality of this estate have deteriorated. Hope the administration, the housing department, can respond. Thank you for Mr. Kwok's question. On the vacancy rate of the retail facilities, there's actually a left sort figure for the smaller shops and the medium shops that actually really good ticket rate. So based on number of shops, it's based on internal floor space, well, rather parent. On the Mr. Kwok's views on the TPS estate management issues, allow me to explain. The tenant purchase scheme estate, the daily management is borne by the incorporated owners, and the management and repairs of the common areas, the housing authority as the landlord will need to contribute towards the cost, and also have our colleagues sitting on their management committee, and the views and arrangement will be relayed to the IO so as to improve the management, while the HC just don't care. If you only relay their views and not cast your vote as the major landlord, you cannot lead the IO and only allow this estate facilities to deteriorate. Well, the kindergarten play the rent towards housing department. They're only responsible to the area in the kindergarten. The damaged roads and facilities are not the HA's responsibility. I think you should look into it, Ms. Wang. We noted your views and we'll bring it back to see what can we do internally. May I ask any other members who would like to put up their hand to speak? If not, we draw the line here. And also remind members that we received a motion from Ms. Jenny Yip and Ho Kai Ming, which I shall deal with later, and hope that other members who are in the tower should can get ready. Ms. Wang, for retail facilities, especially the wet markets, some of them have been contracted out to a single management, to a single company, is it? Yes. Yes, under our contracting system. Have you considered your violation of the competition ordinance on the code of practice? You've been given too much market power to do whatever you want, because they control who to get into the markets and the prices. Well, for example, the quinoa group, it are vertically integrated. So, and grow their own vegetables in mainland and raise their own pigs, and they transport them to Hong Kong and handle their retail. Have you considered in violation of the code of practice and Cap 619 of the competition ordinance? Have you consulted the competition commission? And during the leasing process, we've been attending. However, if you only have a single tender, that means that they'll have the whole market to one operator. So it decide who to who to set up shop there, they'll be abusing its market power. Have you checked out the statutes? Thanks for Mrs. Yip comments. Allow me to make it clear. When we lease our property to an outsourced contractor, we've been through a tendering mechanism. And in the tender document, there will be restrictions on how to operate a wet market. For example, on the users, well, they could lease it to their own subsidiaries, and you can't manage it. They cannot. Actually, they cannot exceed a certain percentage to renting out to their own subsidiaries. Can you give me a checklist of the outsourced contractors? I want to know how many of those belong to the same company. What can supply the information after the meeting? Well, this is under the tendering mechanism, and and within the list of registered contractors, only there are 12 markets under such arrangement. Of this 12th market, they've been managed by different company instead of just one operator. I think you have to consult the Competition Commission's views. I will also do it myself. Thank you, Regina Yip. My turn now. We've been criticizing the lagging behind of community facilities for the early intake of population for newly completed estate. For the after 1 year on, even 2 years after population intake, the wet market shopping center will then be commissioned. The government have been making the same mistake and failed to learn from its lessons for the on-tie estate Anderson Road. This also have this problem. Well, as HA or HD, is there any way that you can be synchronizing the facilities on the social welfare facilities for on-tie estate? The public have been concerned and been mentioned by members. Therefore, we have set up mechanism with SWD. So whenever for the newly intake estate, for 9 months before the occupation, will liaise with SWD so they could arrange the operator to do the fitting out so as to provide the service early. Retail facilities, well, we had a pre-lease arrangement. After pre-lease, we'll wait for the satisfaction certificate to be issued. I think you should review this because you're not able to move in pace with the times. The intake of the population intake of new estate, which there are lagging facilities, have a great nuisance to residents. For on echoing the Regina Yip's question, while the outsourcing to a single contractor or a few contractors, let's say a contractor A failed to manage the wet market, and yet when it surrendered the market, the HA will then retender, and however, the winning bid is actually lodged by the failed operator. That have been criticized by me many times. I think it's called an opaque black box operation. And after listening to sometimes, have you reviewed the standards and the procedures on tendering? And I explained earlier, on the outsourcing system of shopping centers and wet markets, the Commercial Properties Committee of HA have discussed this. And on the public concerns on how do you manage the contractor and enhance the operation performance, we have actually launched some improved initiatives. I hope that can be reflected through the tender document so as to enhance the services. Deputy Director, can you supplement two set of figures to us? First, you said that you have done a review. So when you did a review, and what is the comparison and improvement? As for the outsourced wet markets, have been doing a terrible job. Have you have any penalty mechanism in place so as to lift the performance so that the public will not deprive of a choice?
I hope the DD can provide us with these two figures. All right, we have completed discussion of this item. However, we have two motions without notice from Mrs. Regina Ip and also Mr. Ho Kai-ming respectively. Mrs. Ip is seconded by Ms. Yong Hoi-yen. We don't have a quorum here. Please ring the quorum bell to make sure that all members who are in the council building can come down to room 1 as soon as possible so that we can vote on the two items.
去響下鐘先啊！我去洗手間。啟明啊，爭4個啊！冇晒喎。 好啦，我哋人
So we formed a quorum, and but we have to wait until the quorum bell is done. Mr. Ho Kai-ming, can you read out your motion? Since land of public housing is valuable, I suggest that the housing authority take the following measures to increase or improve the non-residential properties in public housing estates to provide the following services. First, extend or expand public car parks of housing estates to increase the number of parking spaces, to use the rooftop for welfare and community users, use storerooms properly, and to convert them into residential units, and to use idle storerooms for welfare or NGO users. 4, to in future PRH housing projects, there should be basement development for non-residential facilities. Can Mr. Lau Kok-feng come in? Otherwise, we cannot deal with this motion. For those in favor of Mr. Ho Kai-ming's motion, hands up, please. All right, 11-4. We do have a quorum, don't we? Mr. Lau, please wait. Please stay for another minute. 11 members are for the motion. Anyone who opposes the motion? 0. Any abstention? 0. I declare Mr. Ho Kai-ming's motion passed. I will now have to deal with Mrs. Regina Yip's motion, seconded by Ms. Yong Hui Yan. Mrs. Yip, please read it out. To prevent monopoly in the provision of retail facilities and parking spaces and anti-trust behavior, this panel urges the Housing Authority to stop using single tenders in contracting out its services, and to consult the Competition Commission to ensure that there is sufficient competition in the provision of retail facilities and car parks in the states and courts. For those who are in favor of the motion, hands up, please. Unanimous. No objection, no abstention. I declare that Mrs. Regina Yip's motion is passed. So that ends the discussion of this item, AOB. We have not received any AOB items, so the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.